My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an administrative assistant at a transportation company. My job isn't exciting, but it's stable, and it allows me to live alone in a small house in the suburbs. I enjoy the quiet of my neighborhood. I've always considered myself an organized, methodical person, someone who follows a routine. But that Friday, my routine was completely shattered. It was an ordinary workday. I spent the morning answering emails, organizing delivery reports, and mediating small conflicts between drivers and dissatisfied clients. My boss, Henry, is a demanding man, and even on Fridays, he doesn't let anyone breathe. The day was exhausting, and leaving the office at 6 p.m. was a relief. It was raining when I got home. The sky was dark gray, and the deserted streets seemed to have been abandoned by the rush of everyday life. I stepped inside, took off my soaked shoes, and turned on a lamp in the living room. The light flickered twice before stabilizing. It was probably just an electrical issue, but at that moment, the flickering glow made my stomach churn. A shadow of unease I couldn't quite explain settled over me. I had planned for a peaceful evening. I cooked some simple pasta, put on my favorite show, and settled on the couch with a blanket. I couldn't remember the last time I took time for myself, and the sound of the rain outside only made the night more cozy. Until the doorbell rang. My neighborhood is quiet, but that doesn't mean it's busy. After 8 p.m., few people pass by, and the lights in the houses are usually off. It was rare for anyone to show up at that hour, especially on a rainy day. The sound reverberated through the empty house, a metallic ring that seemed louder than it should have been. I got up from the couch, my heart racing for no apparent reason. I walked through the dark living room, avoiding the furniture in the dim light, and looked through the peephole in the door. The man seemed ordinary, a delivery person, at least at first glance. He wore a worn-out, soaked uniform, with a dark cap dripping water, but something was off. He was holding a large box, but his hands were too still, too firm, as if the strength in them was intentional. A feeling of discomfort washed over me. "Delivery for Clara Ferreira," he said, his voice hoarse, dragged out, as if he chewed the words before letting them leave his mouth. He said my name. I know they always do because it's on the delivery, but it made me scared, very scared. I swallowed hard. For a moment, my mind tried to find some logic. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was just a wrong delivery. But something inside me screamed not to open that door. "I didn't order anything," I replied, trying to sound firm. "It's in the system," he insisted, his voice gaining an impatient, almost threatening tone. "I just need you to sign." My breath became shallow. My self-preservation instinct started screaming louder. I moved away from the door silently, cold sweat trickling down my neck. I passed by the side window and, as carefully as I could, peered through the crack. That's when my heart nearly stopped. The glint of something metallic shimmered under the dim light of the street lamp. Attached to his belt, partially hidden under his jacket, was the handle of a gun. My whole body froze. Panic spread like an electric shock, pulsing through my veins. My brain screamed to run, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Suddenly, he turned toward the window, as if he could feel me watching. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the smile he gave me was anything but human. "Clara," he called again, this time in a lower tone. as if he were speaking directly inside my head. "I know you're there." The lights in the living room flickered, although the storm outside was far from violent enough to cause a power outage. The scream I had been holding back finally rose in my throat, but before it could escape, I heard the sound of the door latch turning slowly. I hadn't unlocked the door. The first thing I did was move away from the door, trying to muffle any sound from my footsteps. My whole body was shaking, every movement feeling like it weighed a ton, but I knew I had to act fast. I ran to the kitchen, the silence of the house broken only by the sound of the rain outside. I grabbed my phone from the counter, but it was off because I just wanted a peaceful night. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the phone. My fingers fumbled over the buttons as I tried to turn it on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, the sound I feared most filled the air, the slow, metallic click of the doorknob turning. My heart raced, blind panic threatening to overtake me. He was trying to get in. Without thinking, my eyes scanned the kitchen for something, anything that could protect me. I opened the nearest drawer and pulled out a small pocket knife I used for opening boxes. The blade was short, almost insignificant, but it was all I had. The phone finally turned on, its weak light illuminating my face. I dialed the police, trying to stay calm, but my voice came out in a strangled whisper, more a cry for help than an explanation. "There's someone at my door. He's armed. Please, come quickly." The dispatcher started speaking, her voice firm, trying to calm me down. She wanted details, but before I could respond, the sound froze me. Glass shattering. The noise came from the living room, the sharp, cruel sound of something breaking forcefully. My whole body stiffened, and the knife almost slipped from my sweaty hand. He was no longer just trying to get in. He was inside. The rain seemed to grow louder, or maybe it was the blood pounding in my ears. The dispatcher was still talking on the other end of the line, but her words sounded distant, like they were coming from a world that was no longer mine. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging. They echoed through the room, coming toward me. I knew I didn't have much time. I looked around, searching for an escape route, but the kitchen now felt more like a trap. The sound of the footsteps grew closer, along with a low, almost animalistic breathing. I swallowed hard, gripping the knife tightly. My back was against the wall. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was here, and I knew he hadn't come just to deliver a box. My heart felt like an out-of-control machine, hammering against my chest as if it wanted to escape before I did. He had broken the living room window. He was inside. "Clara, I know you're there. Let's make this easy." His voice cut through the silence, too calm, too cold. The footsteps began, slow and calculated, each movement crushing glass shards under his boots, the sound echoing like an announcement that he was getting closer. I knelt behind the kitchen counter, the small pocket knife trembling in my hands as if it were made of paper. My eyes fixed on the floor, trying to control my breathing, which came in almost inaudible gasps. He kept talking, his voice taking on an almost friendly tone, but laced with something dark, something that made my skin crawl. "I don't want to hurt you. We just need to talk." That calm, it was worse than any scream. He wasn't angry, he was in control, and that was infinitely more terrifying. With trembling fingers, I grabbed my phone and as he continued moving through the house, I sent a quick message to my best friend, Amanda. "Call the police. There's a man in my house." I pressed send, but before I could even breathe a sigh of relief, something changed. The silence between his words became unbearable. Suddenly, the kitchen door slammed open, hitting the wall. There he was. The weak kitchen light illuminated his wet face, raindrops dripping down the brim of his cap, leaving streaks on his soaked jacket. His eyes met mine, and for a second, the world seemed to stop. There was no anger in them, no rush, just a cold, predatory emptiness. "There you are," he said, a pale, twisted smile appearing on his lips. My hands gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. My body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Fear anchored me to the floor, as if he were a shadow consuming everything around me. He took a step forward, his body blocking the only exit. The sound of his shoes against the floor was like a hammer pounding in my chest, each step echoing in my mind. "Clara, why all the drama?" he asked, tilting his head as if genuinely curious. "I just want to talk." His smile grew, and that's when I realized he was enjoying himself. This game, this hunt, was exactly what he wanted. And me, I was the prey. He was far more terrifying than he had seemed through the peephole. The seconds I spent observing him, trying to understand what was happening, only made things clearer and more terrifying. His eyes were completely cold, empty, as if there were no human being behind that facade. There was something sickening in the way he looked, something that made me believe he had done this before. And the way he held the box, it was as if it were an extension of his own will, relentless. Something deep in my stomach twisted with an indescribable sense of dread. "I just need a few minutes of your time, Clara. Make room for a conversation," he said, his voice smooth, as if asking for a favor, but his eyes, those eyes, they burned with a silent threat. He crouched down and placed the box on the floor without hurry, as if settling something precious, something that belonged to me. It was instinctive. Terror pushed me into action. My body reacted before my mind could process it. I attacked, the blade of the pocket knife slicing his arm. The sound of the metal tearing through flesh was deafening, but his scream froze me to the bone. It wasn't just pain. It was a scream of rage, of pure hatred, and it was so shrill it seemed to pierce my soul. The sound of the metal tearing through flesh was deafening, but his scream froze me to the bone. It wasn't just pain. It was a scream of rage, of pure hatred, and it was so shrill it seemed to pierce my soul. But he didn't flinch. He didn't stop. In a swift, merciless movement, he shoved me with brutal force against the counter. The pain exploded in my head when I hit it hard, and for a moment, everything went dark. A metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, and I realized something warm was running down my face. The knife slipped from my hands, useless, sliding across the cold kitchen floor, like a cruel reminder that I was defenseless. He moved closer, a sadistic smile curving his lips, and his eyes gleamed with pleasure. He was enjoying the fear, the pain, the despair. He whispered, his voice low and poisoned, "You're making this harder." My body was paralyzed by pain and terror, but a wave of adrenaline pushed me forward. He crouched to pick up the weapon that had fallen to the floor, and that was my only chance. In a desperate move, I kicked the weapon away, far enough that he couldn't reach it so quickly. The rush in my body carried me into the living room. Every muscle was alert, and the pain in my head was almost unbearable. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him catch me. Each step I took was a cry for survival. But the sound of his footsteps echoed closer, like a promise that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. I was running, but I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. I ran toward the landline, my only salvation, but before I could even grab the receiver, he reached me. I barely felt the impact, only hearing the muffled sound of my breath and the snap of my neck being twisted backward when he yanked me by my hair. Panic took over me, but there was nothing I could do. In one brutal move, he threw me to the ground, and I felt the wooden floorboards pressing against my spine, the air forced out of my lungs. The pain in my head was intense, but it was when he pulled the knife from his jacket that the terror became tangible. The blade gleamed under the weak, flickering light of the room, like a snake ready to strike. He approached me with the knife raised, and I could see the hatred in his face. "You just had to cooperate," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. I didn't know how, but something inside me finally broke through the barrier of fear. The only thing I could do was fight, so my eyes searched for something, anything, that could save me. That's when I saw it. The metal lamp, at the edge of the table, seemed so insignificant, but it was my only chance. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I grabbed it, and with all the strength desperation gave me, I struck him directly on the head. The sound of metal hitting his skull was dull but effective. He staggered backward, stunned, his knife slipping out of his hand as he writhed on the floor. But I couldn't wait to see if he would recover. I had no time. I got up with a choked scream and ran to the bedroom, my legs almost failing beneath me. When I reached the door, locking it with all the strength I had left, I shoved the dresser against it, blocking it as best I could, but my mind was far from finding peace. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely grab my phone. When I finally dialed the police again, my voice was almost inaudible, a thread of hopelessness in the chaos. "Please, he's trying to kill me. Come quickly." I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to hear any sign of help, but the only sound that cut through the line was the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. He was getting closer. Each step sounded like a war drum, announcing the end. All I could hear was his laughter, a low, insane laugh that made the blood freeze in my veins. "This won't save you, Clara," he shouted, his voice distorted by madness. I froze, trying not to make a sound, but the door trembled, the banging intensifying with every second. He was there, laughing at my escape attempt. He knew I couldn't get away. And deep down, I knew he was right. The sirens began to wail in the distance, first as a muffled sound, almost an illusion, but soon they became clear and growing, like a beacon of hope in the darkness. For the first time that night, something inside me reacted. It was a small wave of relief, a breath of hope that seemed impossible to believe, but still made me feel as though, maybe, I wasn't going to be left to die in that house. But he heard it too. The sound of the sirens cut through the air, and immediately he stopped. The silence that took over the house afterward was deafening, so heavy that it felt as if time itself had frozen. I could feel the tension in the air, as if he were waiting, preparing for some kind of reaction. My body was paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, waiting, but not knowing what would come next. Then, with a low sigh, almost imperceptible. He spoke, his voice heavy with anger and frustration. "This isn't over." Those words hit me like a blow to the chest. Yet another reminder that no matter how much I had escaped, no matter how close the sirens were, he wasn't done yet. Before I could react, he turned and, with the speed of a predator, disappeared from my sight, fleeing through the kitchen window with the same unshakable calm with which he had entered. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. He was already gone, but the feeling that he was still watching me, still hunting me, didn't fade. I knew he could come back. I knew he was waiting for the right moment. When the police finally entered, breaking the oppressive silence with their shouts and commands, the first thing I noticed was the emptiness. He had already left. He had left everything behind. The knife, the box, even the promise that it wasn't over. I still felt the weight of the threat in the air, the sense that nothing had been resolved, that the nightmare had only taken a pause. And, even though I was safe now, the truth was that the feeling that he was still out there, waiting, never left me. My house was never the same again. Since that night, the feeling of safety disappeared, swallowed by the shadow of something I knew was real, but that no one else seemed to fully understand. I installed cameras in every corner, reinforced locks on the doors and windows, alarms on every vulnerable point, as if all those measures could somehow erase what happened. But deep down, I knew that none of that could protect me from the fear that had settled inside me. None of it could make me forget the cold, empty eyes or the feeling that he was still watching me. Even with all the precautions, I can no longer sleep without a knife under my pillow. It seems irrational, but the weight of the metal under my hands is the only comfort I find, the only sign of control I have over my own life. Every time I close my eyes, a part of me expects him to appear again. The sound of a creaking door, the snap of a window opening, makes my body tense and alert. It's as if my body has learned to live in a constant state of terror. I know he can come back. I know that, as long as he's out there, the threat will never go away. The police never found the man. They have theories, hypotheses, but no concrete suspects. The only conclusion they reached was that he's probably a serial criminal, but knowing that offers no comfort. To me, it's just another confirmation that there are people like him, out there, lurking, waiting for the next victim. The sirens, the police, all the attempts to find answers, none of it erased the sense of vulnerability that has clung to me since the moment he entered my life. I survived, yes, but the cost was high. I am not the same person anymore. I've changed in a way I can barely understand. Every doorbell that rings at night, every sound from outside, makes my heart race, my body freeze in panic. Fear has become a part of me, like a second skin, and I don't know how to live without it. The shadows in the corners, the strange looks from strangers on the street, all make me question if I'm safe, if someone will appear again, or if it will be the end. And now, I ask you, what if it were in your house? Would you feel safe, even with all the cameras, locks, and alarms? Or would the fear infiltrate even your dreams, making you feel his presence, even without seeing him? When I bought that house, it was meant to be my refuge. Small, with exposed brick walls, it sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees that made the wind sing at night. A peaceful place, I thought at the time, perfect for someone like me, who valued peace and silence. But what seemed like a practical and charming choice turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. It was shortly after my vacation that everything started to fall apart. I had spent 2 weeks with my sister in Richardson, Texas, away from routine, the house, and everything that reminded me of work. When I returned, on a Sunday evening, the atmosphere already felt different. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the wind, which once sounded like a melody, now seemed like a lament. An uncomfortable feeling grew in my chest with each step toward the front door. I entered, carrying my bags, and immediately the smell hit me. Something was wrong. The familiar scent of old wood had been replaced by a damp odor, as if the house had been abandoned for years, even after just 2 weeks. I looked around. Everything seemed intact, except for the guest room door at the end of the hall. It was closed. Not only that, it was locked. I was sure I had left it open. I almost never used that room, except to store boxes of old things and furniture that didn't match the rest of the house. My chest tightened as I approached. I grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it. The latch didn't budge, and the dry sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have. It was the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl. I tried again, this time with force, but nothing. I crouched down to look through the crack in the keyhole, my throat dry. Inside, everything was submerged in darkness. No objects, no shapes. Just emptiness, an emptiness that seemed to pulse. Maybe the wood swelled, I murmured to myself, trying to smother the wave of panic. But I knew it was a lie. Something about that door was wrong. I decided to leave it for the next day. I didn't want to deal with it alone that night. The silence in that house, which had once comforted me, now felt like a suffocating weight. Every little sound was amplified. Every creak of the wood echoed like a groan. In bed, I couldn't relax. My whole body seemed on alert, as if waiting for something inevitable. And then it happened. At first, it was just a low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the hall. But as I focused, I realized what it was. Scratching. A rhythmic, dry sound, like nails or something metal scraping against the wall. My blood ran cold. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make sense of it. The sound continued, methodical, slow, growing closer. When I mustered the courage to sit up in bed, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The feeling of being watched was palpable. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, unable to close my eyes, unable to move. But it wasn't just the sound that terrified me. It was what it meant. That house, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a strange, hostile place. And I knew, deep down, that what was on the other side of that door was something I didn't want to face. Still, the worst part was realizing that the sound was coming from inside the guest room. The next morning, the decision was inevitable. I called a locksmith. I didn't have the courage to face it alone, and every minute in that house seemed to drain me. Jorge arrived promptly at noon. He was a sturdy man, with calloused hands and an expression that mixed patience and boredom, as if nothing surprised him anymore in life. But when I explained what had happened, I noticed a subtle change in his face. His eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to assess whether I was lying or just paranoid. "Did the door lock by itself?" he asked, his tone heavy with skepticism. I just nodded, not wanting to justify myself. Something in the back of my mind told me that if I explained too much, I'd just seem crazier. Jorge sighed, grabbed his tools, and headed down the hallway. Each step he took seemed heavier than the last as I followed him. When he began working on the lock, the sound of metal against metal seemed to echo through the house, each turn of the mechanism amplifying my anxiety. My eyes were fixed on the door, but it was as if I already knew what I would find. The latch gave way with a sharp click, and Jorge slowly pushed the door open. The smell was the first thing that hit us, dense, sour, almost suffocating. A mixture of mold, sweat, and something else. Something I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach churn. "What the hell?" murmured Jorge, but he didn't finish the sentence. I was right behind him, and the sight over his shoulder was enough to make me instinctively step back. The room, once a messy but harmless space, now looked like a scene of pure despair. The mattress that used to be against the wall was thrown on the floor, with a crumpled sleeping bag on top. It was as if someone had improvised a bed. On the floor, crushed food wrappers were scattered around. Cut water bottles were piled in a corner, used as makeshift containers. But it was the knife that made me freeze. It was on the desk, deliberately placed, almost like a centerpiece. There was no blood, no stains, just the clean blade, gleaming in the weak light coming through the window. It was almost like a warning. The walls were marked with deep scratches, arranged in chaotic patterns, as if someone had spent days or weeks there, trying to escape. Jorge stepped back, breathing heavily. "I think we'd better call the police," he said, his voice firm but low, almost as if he feared being heard by something. He hurried out of the room, leaving the door open, and went straight for the exit of the house. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to take my eyes off the marks on the walls. When I got closer, something caught my attention. Among the scratches, there were words scrawled, almost faded, trembling, desperate letters. With trembling fingers, I touched one and read aloud, barely able to form the words, "Don't come back." A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. The police arrived quickly, less than an hour after I called. What should have been a relief quickly turned into more discomfort. There were two of them, a young officer, clearly freshly graduated, with alert eyes and quick movements, and an older one, named Gonsalves, with a heavy gaze and exhaustion written on his face. As if he had seen too much, they carefully inspected the room, but there didn't seem to be much urgency or haste. The knife, the marks on the walls, the oppressive smell, none of it seemed to be enough for them. The young officer tried to be professional while asking questions. Where had I been? How long had I been gone? Had I left anyone with the key? My answers came mechanically, as if my mind was disconnected from it all, while my eyes remained fixed on the bedroom door. The scene seemed glued to my head. Gonsalves, on the other hand, was more attentive to the details. He crouched down to inspect the lock from the inside, running his fingers over the worn wood. "You know, whoever did this probably wanted total control over who comes and goes," he said, his voice deep. "This kind of thing, it's methodical, planned. It's possible the person is still out there." Those words froze me. He said them as if commenting on the weather, but to me, they sounded like a sentence. Deep down, I already knew. Since I returned home, I had felt like I wasn't alone. It was as if the house breathed with a rhythm different from mine, as if something invisible were watching my every move. The police left with a simple, "We'll investigate," as if that were enough to make me sleep in peace. It wasn't. By nightfall, I was a wreck. I locked every window, dragged chairs against the doors, and checked every lock more than once. Everything seemed still, but the silence was even worse than the noise from before. It had weight. It had intentions. I lay in bed with the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand, my fingers trembling over the police call button. The exhaustion was immense, but the fear was greater. And then it began. First, it was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible. Footsteps, light, hesitant, as if someone were in the hallway trying not to be heard. My heart raced, each beat sounding too loud in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the footsteps continued, now closer, closer still. My hand was sweaty, the phone slipping from my fingers, but I couldn't move to hold it better. Every muscle in my body seemed paralyzed. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, the doorknob to my room turning. Slowly, trying to open. I couldn't gather the courage to stand. I couldn't scream. I sat there on the bed, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to give way at any moment. The doorknob turned with a methodical, insistent rhythm, and with each attempt, I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable. But the door didn't open. The sound stopped. The silence returned, but it was even more terrifying than before. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, clutching my phone, listening to my own muffled breathing and the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. When the sun finally rose, everything was still. I got up with shaky legs, slowly opened the door, and looked down the hall. There was no one. No sign that anyone had been there, but something was different. On the floor, right in front of my door, was a small object. A knife. Not the one from the guest room. It was another, smaller, but equally sharp. Next to it, scrawled on the floor with what seemed to be charcoal, a single word. Tomorrow, I decided to move. There was nothing more to be done. That house, once my refuge, had turned into a prison. Every wall seemed to suffocate. Every sound seemed to stalk me. Every shadow reminded me that I wasn't safe. It didn't matter how many times I locked the doors or piled furniture against them. Fear always found a way in. I packed my things in a hurried afternoon, taking only the essentials. Clothes, documents, a few photos. I didn't have the courage to enter the guest room again. I left behind furniture, memories, and everything else. The house, with its exposed brick walls and the wind singing in the trees, could rot on its own. I just wanted distance. The relief was immediate, but brief. In the new apartment, smaller and higher up, with no dark hallways or strange rooms, I finally slept through the night. But the sense of freedom didn't last long. Weeks later, while organizing my new kitchen, I realized something. My sharpest kitchen knife was gone. At first, I tried to justify it. Maybe I had left it behind. Maybe it was in some still-closed box. I searched every drawer, every corner, sifted through the remaining boxes, but the knife was nowhere to be found. I knew I had packed it. I remembered carefully placing it in the box, almost as if I already knew that something so small might matter. The discovery unsettled me, but not desperately so. Not at first. It was just a knife, after all. But then the nights began to change. Small things started happening. A noise in the hallway, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, in the living room. a sensation, a certainty that someone was watching me. Now, every night before I sleep, I check every door and window. I test the locks several times, pull the curtains, inspect even the most unlikely corners of the apartment. But nothing is ever enough. There's always a flaw, a detail I might have missed. And even when everything seems secure, the fear is still there, whispering, because I know whoever he is still out there, waiting. Sometimes, I hear footsteps in the hallway. Footsteps that stop right in front of my door, but never enter. Other times, I see something out of the corner of my eye's shadow, a movement. And then there's the worst. When I'm about to fall asleep, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like metal scraping wood. It's brief, but enough to steal my sleep. There are nights when I wake up with the feeling that I'm not alone. My heart races, sweat runs down my forehead, and I freeze, listening to my own breath. On those nights, my mind goes back to that missing knife. I think of it as a reminder that he hasn't forgotten me. He's waiting. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. And when that day comes, he won't need an unlocked door, because deep down, he never really left me. The day started gray, as if the weather sensed something out of the ordinary. My apartment was small but cozy, a simple place in an old building, with exposed brick walls and narrow windows. It was on the 4th floor, far enough from the street noise, but close enough for me to hear the hurried footsteps of people passing by. Outside, a light rain dripped on the window ledges, creating small streams that ran down to the cracked pavement. The muffled sound of cars passing blended with the occasional creak of the old plumbing in the building. The lighting in the apartment was dim, with the kitchen light flickering from time to time. This detail always bothered me, but it seemed too small to fix. It was one of those days when the silence inside the house felt heavier. Something was different, but I couldn't pinpoint what. My name is Rose. I'm 28 years old and work from home, which gives me the freedom I've always desired, but also condemns me to long periods of solitude. I've always been independent, always enjoyed my own company, but sometimes loneliness catches up with me. It comes silently, like a thick fog, making everything heavier, denser. I've always tried to ignore this feeling, after all. Who wants to seem weak or dependent? But there are moments when the stillness becomes oppressive, and that's when perception begins to fail. That day, I was wearing a loose sweatshirt and old slippers, trying to feel comfortable, to relax after a week of intense work. My day had been normal up until then. A rushed breakfast, a few quick work calls, and then a glance at social media, as I always do to fill the silences in the empty environment. Nothing seemed out of place, and it's this normality that made what was to come even more terrifying. The sound of the doorbell snapped me out of my thoughts, and for a moment I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. I hesitated. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. When I finally stood up and opened it, there he was. The man. Tall, wearing a spotless blue uniform, an ID badge hanging from his chest, and an expression that at first seemed overly friendly. He smiled. A wide, constant smile, something rehearsed, as if it were part of a performance. His eyes were dark, devoid of shine, almost empty, but he smiled. Smiled all the time. Good morning. You're Rose, right? The sound of my name coming from his mouth felt wrong, as if he knew too much about me. It shouldn't have been strange, of course. He had access to the company's records. Maybe he'd seen my name somewhere. But there was something in the tone of his voice that sent a chill down my spine. Something I couldn't explain. An unsettling feeling that he knew more about me than he should. I wanted to shut the door, ignore him, but something inside me, maybe the fear of being rude, made me step aside and let him in. He entered without waiting, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing in my quiet apartment. The man began talking about an internet connection issue, something vague and too technical for me to understand. He mentioned fiber cables, signal drops, but all I could focus on was the mechanical movement of his hands, fiddling with the modem with an odd concentration, as if that wasn't all he was adjusting. He looked around carefully, almost obsessively, his eyes scanning every corner of my apartment. He was studying the environment, but not like a technician would, more like someone searching for something. Or someone. "Everything's fine so far, but I need to check the bedroom," he said, pointing toward the hallway. The air grew heavier. I wanted to refuse, but the words wouldn't come out. What did he want in my bedroom? My instinct, the one I usually ignored, screamed inside me. But again, I gave in. Part of me told me I was being paranoid. The man seemed trustworthy, professional. After all, he was there to fix something. However, as he approached the hallway, the discomfort grew. I watched him, my mind trying to process what was happening. He wasn't just going to my bedroom to check something technical. He was going there with a purpose. I could feel it in the tension in the air, in the way he moved. His footsteps were heavier now, slower, as if he were savoring each moment of my vulnerability. When he reached the door of my bedroom, something inside me finally awakened. He turned to me with an even wider smile, moving toward the doorknob. "Just a moment, Rose," he said, his voice low, almost whispering, and the sound of it echoed in my mind like a warning. Something wasn't right. It hadn't been right from the start. I didn't know what to do, so I retreated to the back of the apartment, feeling my body tremble as my heart raced. The door to the bedroom creaked when he opened it, and I stood there, paralyzed. Something was about to happen. Something much worse than I could imagine. He was in my bedroom now, but what was he looking for in there? Inside the bedroom, he barely touched the equipment. His presence was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. He spent more time looking around, his gaze meticulous, analyzing every corner, every detail. It was as if he were taking inventory of my space, as if he wanted to mark his territory. The tension in the air was palpable, and the feeling of being watched increased with every passing second. He moved with an unsettling calm, taking his time, as if time wasn't a concern. I felt like he wasn't just there to fix something. He was there for something more, something much darker. He tried to make conversation, but not about anything related to work. His voice was soft, controlled, but there was something more behind his words, something that sent a chill down my spine. "How long have you lived here?" "Always alone?" he asked. His tone was casual, but at the same time, there was an invasion in his words, a sense that he was trying to strip me bare, to explore my weaknesses. It wasn't just a simple question. He wanted to know more, to uncover something that wasn't visible on the surface. The way he said "always alone" made my throat tighten. It wasn't the first time someone had asked such a question, but with him, the answer felt dangerous. I tried to stay calm, focusing on what I needed to do. I pretended to be distracted enough not to show the terror that was taking over me. Is everything okay? Because my internet is working fine, I said, trying to steer the conversation, trying to make him feel like he was just doing a simple, irrelevant job. But he just smiled. That empty smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. It was as if he was enjoying my discomfort, as if he knew something I didn't. And in that moment, I knew there was something wrong, something terribly wrong. Almost done. Can I get a glass of water? He said, and his voice sounded more like an order than a request. I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet, in shock, obeying the request. I went to the kitchen, trying to take deep breaths to calm myself, but even there, I could feel my heartbeat quickening, the anxiety growing like a pressure in my chest. As I was filling the glass with water, his reflection in the window glass froze me. He was standing in the hallway, motionless, staring at the closet door. He wasn't touching anything, but his eyes were fixed on that door, as if waiting for something, or someone, to come out. A wave of terror washed over me, and I almost spilled the water. What was he doing there? Why was he so focused on the closet door? His morbid curiosity was becoming more and more frightening. I quickly went back to the bedroom, trying to keep my composure, but when I saw him again, I realized something had changed. He seemed calmer, more controlled. But I knew it was a facade. There was something different in the air, something that made me feel even more vulnerable. My body was tense, every muscle contracted, and my heart pounded in my chest, almost suffocating me. I wanted him to leave, for everything to go back to normal, but deep down I knew nothing would ever be normal again after this. The worst was still to come. I could feel it. The pressure in the air was becoming unbearable, and fear was creeping into every corner of my mind, telling me I wasn't alone in that room, that something else was there. Something that couldn't be explained. After he left, I felt a slight wave of relief, a momentary sensation that the worst was over. I closed the door, locked the bolts hurriedly, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the panic that still clung to my skin. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, something inside me wouldn't calm down. An increasing discomfort, a feeling that something was still wrong, that he hadn't really left. He was somewhere, lurking. An hour later, the doorbell rang again. The sound sliced through the dense air of the house, and a cold wave ran through me. I stood still for a moment, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. As I approached the door, I hesitated. There was no one there. Just the emptiness in front of my door, and a pressure in my chest that grew with each passing second. I went to the window, my hands shaking, and looked outside. Across the street, a black car was parked, stationary, like a shadow waiting. The windows were closed, and I couldn't see who was inside, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My body froze. I knew, deep down, that I was being watched. Before I could react, my phone rang. The unknown number on the screen made my stomach churn. I answered, not knowing what to expect, and my neighbor Mari's voice came through, a muffled scream on the line. "Rose, that technician. He doesn't work for the company." I just called them, and they said they didn't send anyone today. I was speechless. The air seemed to thicken, and my mind started to spin. He knew my name. He knew exactly where I lived. He had been inside my house, in every room, watching, studying my space. He was already in my apartment, in my life, much more than any stranger should be. And then, in the silence, came the sound that froze my blood, the key turning in the door's lock. I froze. The sound of metal cutting through the stillness of my apartment was like a sentence. He was back, and now there was no place left for me to hide. Panic overtook me, but something inside me kept telling me not to make a sound. I slithered into the kitchen cupboard, trying to control my breathing, the phone still in my hand, too scared to hang up but also too scared to speak. His footsteps echoed through the house. No rush, no nervousness. He was calm, too calm, as if he knew I had no place to run, that he had already cornered me. Rose. His voice came low, like a whisper, but it echoed throughout the apartment, full of malice. You should be more careful. My throat tightened, and a wave of nausea hit me. The silence that followed was suffocating. He was closer now. Every second felt like an eternity. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I didn't move. I just hid, made myself as small as possible, trying not to make a sound, trying not to draw attention. And then, in the middle of that torment, I heard something that cut through the air like a blade. The sound of police sirens, coming from a distance. He stopped walking for a moment, his steps becoming more hurried, more desperate, as if he knew time was running out. I knew what was happening. He was trying to leave before it was too late. The sound of the sirens grew closer, but before the police could reach the door, he had already disappeared. When they entered, the door was open, but it was empty. He was gone, like a shadow, without leaving a trace. The only thing left was the damaged lock and the closet door open, as if he had known exactly where I was, as if he had found me before I even realized. He knew. He had always known. They never found him. He simply disappeared, like a shadow swallowed by the darkness, leaving no trace. The police did what they could, but it seemed like he had never existed, like a fleeting nightmare, a ghost that faded with the light of day. Deep down, I knew he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. He became a part of me, an invisible presence, always around me, like a stain of shadow I couldn't wash away. The worst part was that he didn't leave. He stayed, like an indelible mark on my life. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I closed my eyes, that empty smile would appear in my mind, cold, distant, but as real as the pain in my soul. I could see his eyes, those dark, empty eyes, reflecting a kind of sadistic pleasure, as if he knew he had marked me forever. And I knew that, somehow, he was waiting, just waiting for the right moment to return. Months passed, but the sense of fear didn't fade. Every doorbell that rang, every shadow that moved at night, kept me on edge. The loneliness I once accepted now haunted me. The silence in my home was oppressive, as if he was still waiting for a mistake, a moment of weakness, to come back. He had been the worst kind of intruder, the one who not only entered my home, but also my mind. And, every time night fell, when the darkness took over everything, I knew he was still there, with his empty smile, waiting in the shadow. I've always been a meticulous person, especially when it comes to safety. I live alone in an apartment on the third floor of an old building, but well maintained. The building has that unassuming look, like any other, but there's something about it that has never allowed me to feel completely comfortable. It's as if the very air carries an unsettling sense, a silent omen. Since I moved here 2 years ago, I developed the habit of double-checking every night that all the doors and windows were securely locked. I knew something could happen. Something was waiting to happen. That night I came home later than usual from work. The day had been exhausting, and all I wanted was a hot shower and my bed. But as I walked down the hallway to my apartment, a strange, chilling sensation ran down my spine. That typical shiver you get when you feel like you're being watched. I looked around, but no one was there. I ignored it, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue. When I entered my apartment, I tossed my backpack onto the couch and went straight to the bedroom. As I approached the window, I noticed something that made my heart race. It was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before leaving, because I always do. My mind tried to rationalize, but the unease was stronger. I took a deep breath, and with trembling hands I closed the window firmly, locking it again. I decided to take a shower to relax. The hot water, which should have calmed me, seemed to weigh heavier on my shoulders. I closed my eyes under the stream of water, trying to push away that uncomfortable feeling, as if something was moving in the shadows around me. After the shower, I put on my pajamas and crawled into bed, turning off the light. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound, no matter how small, seemed to resonate like thunder in my head. The weight of fear felt more real than anything else. Finally, sleep took me, but not peacefully. I don't know how much time had passed before I felt something cold touch my leg. I jolted awake, my heart racing, my pupils dilated. The room was shrouded in darkness, and the silence felt denser, as if the air had thickened. I looked around frantically, but saw nothing. However, the feeling of terror didn't leave me. Something was wrong. I got out of bed and turned on the light. The room seemed in order, but there was a strange smell in the air, a mix of something metallic and sweet, as if someone had been there. I tried to convince myself it was just my tired mind, but that sensation, that presence, wouldn't go away. I walked over to the window and checked everything again. Everything was locked. I returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come back. I lay there, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening. Then I heard a sound coming from the living room. Footsteps, light, almost inaudible, but they were there, as if someone was walking carefully, trying not to be heard. A chill ran through my body, but doubt still tormented me. Was my mind playing tricks? I slowly got up and grabbed my phone. Adrenaline coursed through my body, each beat of my heart sounding deafening. I walked into the living room, each step feeling like something invisible was following me. When I got there, the room was empty, but something made me swallow hard. The front door was ajar. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. I rushed to the door and slammed it shut, locking it again. I returned to the bedroom, panic starting to spread through my veins. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and placed it beside the bed, the cold blade reflecting the faint glow of the light. Every shadow seemed to move subtly, as if it were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night passed slowly, as if time were working against me. I couldn't rest. Every sound, every movement made me jump out of bed. When the daylight finally appeared, it was a momentary relief, a false sense of safety. I got up and went to the window. And that's when something made my blood run cold. The window was open again. Panic filled my body. Someone was entering my apartment, and I didn't know how or why. I was being hunted. I decided to call the police. When they arrived, they searched the apartment but found nothing. They said it was probably just my imagination, that I was stressed and needed rest. But I knew it wasn't just my mind. Someone was there, watching me, waiting, chasing me. I decided to install security cameras in the apartment. I spent the entire day setting them up, covering every possible corner. I knew this wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop until something else happened. That night, I sat in the living room, my eyes glued to the footage on my phone. Everything seemed normal until around 2 a.m., when I saw something move on the screen. A dark figure, crawling silently, entering through the window of my bedroom. My heart nearly stopped. I was shaking, but I called the police immediately. They took their time, as always, but by the time they arrived, the figure had vanished. The cameras didn't lie. They searched the apartment again, but this time something changed. They believed me. They said someone was actually getting in, and that I should consider moving. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. This apartment was my home, my sanctuary. I wasn't going to let anyone drive me out. I decided to fight. I installed more cameras, more locks, more bolts. I spent nights on watch, waiting, fearing that at any moment something or someone would invade again. A week passed in silence. I started to believe that maybe it was all over, that the intruder had given up. But that night, I heard the noise coming from the bedroom again. My heart froze. I ran there, and as I feared, the window was open once more. But there was something different this time. Something that couldn't be explained. A presence, as if the air was thicker. A heavy breath. Before I could react, I felt a sharp blow to my head. Darkness consumed me. I woke up in a hospital, my head throbbing with pain. The police were there, telling me I had been attacked. They found the intruder, a man who had recently been fired and was desperate for money. He had followed me, watched me, planned everything, every move. I survived, but the scars remained. Physical and emotional, I could never sleep peacefully again. Every sound, every movement, made me wake up, feeling the terror in my throat. Paranoia, now, is my constant companion. I moved to another apartment, but the fear never left me. It never has. The feeling that someone is watching me, chasing me, never disappeared. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still feel that cold touch on my leg. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us bring you more of the most terrifying tales. And if you're not yet subscribed to American Terrifying Tales, make sure to do it now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chilling story. We'd love to know, which story scared you the most so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback means everything to us. And don't stop here. Check out the other videos on the channel and dive even deeper into this dark, eerie world. See you in the next story, if you dare.